Want to welcome you to Queensborough Community College's Fall Presidential Lecture Series and our very special lecturer, Mr. Hank Sheinkopf of Sheinkopf Communications. The Presidential Lecture Series was begun in 2000 with the fall lecturer coming from the university or a sector, a national sector in which the university works. In this case, clearly, there are so many to choose from with Mr. Sheinkopf, but he's also an alumnus of the university and continues to complete studies for even more advanced degrees. So I'm sure he'll be distinguished as a professor in addition to being a lecturer one of these days. In the spring, we have a presidential lecturer representing our faculty, and we look forward to sharing that announcement with you shortly. Our professors are rather distinguished in and of their own body, and it's always a wonderful opportunity for the community and members of the faculty and staff and our students to join us for these events. We have a presidential lecture committee, and I'd like to thank them very much for their work. Dr. Sasan Karimi. Dr. Sasan Karimi was previously a presidential lecturer. Dr. Amy Traver. Dr. Mark Van Els, Vice President Karen Steele, and myself. And we appreciate your input and recommendations going forward, those of you who are members of our community and our campus. With us today, we have several distinguished guests. Not that you're all not distinguished. However, we're fortunate to have the Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Operating Officer, Alan Dobrin, and his wife, Linda, here. And I want to thank you for making the time to come. And we also have a gentleman by the name of Eduardo Marti, who began this series back in 2000. Dr. Marti is our Vice Chancellor for Community Colleges at the university. Welcome home again. Okay. Well, I'm rather curious as to what happened last week, and I don't know that any of us is really sure, but Mr. Sheinkopf, who has a lifetime experience in observation and certainly in strategies for campaigns and the aftermath, will offer his insights as to the outcome of the most recent elections, both local, state, maybe national too. His presentation will include Q&A. He's looking forward to hearing some wonderfully stimulating questions from our audience, and we never fail in that regard. So I'm going to turn the podium over to Mr. Sheinkopf, and again, please welcome him.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, President, and hello to so many friends in the room, and thank you, Ronnie Weprin, for being of assistance today. I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then I'm going to ask you to ask me questions so we can all talk together. Let me make a couple of observations about what I think didn't occur. I don't think this is the end of the Earth. There is not, Martians are not landing, okay? This is not coming to an end. There will be no massive hurricanes or flash floods. That's not what occurred last week. But something else more significant occurred, okay? To say in the year 2010 that the American political system is frayed is to be less than accurate. To say that it is in trouble is probably much more accurate for a whole host of reasons. And it's not that we should bury it yet. You got to be reasonable and say this has lasted for more than 200 years. It's done very well. It's taken the shocks of a Watergate. And in other countries, if you had a thing like Watergate occur or an Iran Gate or the attempt to pack the court by Roosevelt or the creation of a national bank, you'd probably have massive insurrections in the street and people taking to the streets and killing themselves or others. That didn't happen here. So this system, as we know it, has lasted rather well and done a good job. Before we get that, I'd like to take a point of personal privilege. It's kind of a moving experience for me to come to this campus. The first time I was ever here was in 1967, which was before the beginning of the world, I think. And because I was in the first class at York College, and the classroom were the two Quonset huts at the edge of the campus, and the offices were the two Quonset huts at the end of the campus. And I think that my life really began here, and the university gave someone like me who had come from very poor circumstances and absolutely no shot, an education, the opportunity to become whatever people think I became. I did my master's in the university. I was a policeman, and Alan Dobrin, who's here, he and I wrote our first exams together. And if I get a little more patience, I'll finish my dissertation, and I'll be doctor, and then you can all do what? You know what. Anyway, I owe a lot to this university, so I'm very glad to be here, and I'm very glad to see all of you. I think that my life probably began here, and it is with deep gratitude all these years later, after having traveled millions of miles, literally, to do whatever this is that I do, that the beginnings of that road began here, and I hope the beginnings of similar roads occur under great leadership for thousands of other young people. That being said, I've worked on just some biographical data so we can put this in context. I've worked on an estimated 700 campaigns in 44 American states and 15 foreign nations for heads of state all over the world at every level, from city council to president. I'm a former presidential advisor. I worked for President Clinton in '95 and '96. And I'm uniquely qualified to talk about the relationships between what happened last week and what happened in '94, because in 1995, after the loss of both houses of Congress to the Republicans by the Democrats, I was one of the people Dick Morris, recruited. He never did anything with me, I want to be clear about that. Recruited to go to the White House and help the president get out of the problem. But let's define what the problem is, and let's define what occurred. The Democrats lost the Congress last week. They think they won the Senate. They probably did by votes, but they didn't win the Senate. There's something else going on here. Democrats across the board lost college-educated people. They lost Catholics. They lost blue-collar people. They became a marginalized party in most states. The gains that they made in 2008 were completely reversed in states which generally were heavily Catholic, or regions that are heavily Catholic. Even in New York State, for example, if we look at the 5-seat loss and we look at where it occurred, we look at the ethnic and racial makeup and divisions of those places, they tend to be heavily Catholic, heavily blue-collar. Upstate, Staten Island, all gone. So the party that was supposed to go back to its original roots of being the representative of the working class in the country reversed itself and went in the other direction. Very hard to put into context. We'd think that in an economic recession where unemployment hovers, we estimate at 10%, but where if you go to Flint, Michigan, the unemployment rate is probably closer to 25%, and probably averages out in the nation at above 10, I'd say in the 12 range and better, easy. If you go to those places where you would think the Democrats would do better because of the Democratic identification with blue-collar people and working-class issues, then in fact, they didn't do well at all. In fact, it was quite the opposite, much like what happened in 1980 with Ronald Reagan. So how do we get to this point? We take a thumbnail sketch of American politics in the last, let's say, 45 years or so, or maybe a little less. Let's go to 1968, and let's look at what happened. And let's look at that kind of, I think, by the way, my biases are that region and religion determine political activity more than most other things. And that ideology is really important, and that I want to leave the ideological argument aside. Let me come back to region and religion. 1968 ends the 40-year relationship between Catholics in this country and the Democratic Party. Why? 1928, which the late scholar and the extraordinary, the most important American political scientist in the 20th century, who won VOK, determined that 1928 was a critical election. We defined critical elections as points in time where for your purposes, where extraordinary things happen, where the historical conditions are right for a major shift in party activity and voting patterns. Okay, that's clear enough for our discussion. So 28 is a critical election. The mantra in newspapers across the country is that Al Smith, the then governor of New York and the candidate for president of the Democratic Party, would bring Romanism and rebellion to the country. Headlines across the nation, excoriating Catholics, abusing them, accusing them of the most extraordinary crimes. Remember, 1928 is only 65 years since the Know Nothing Party, which was the anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant party, was able to create near majorities and control the governor's offices in states. I mean, Massachusetts, where you wouldn't think it possible, but Massachusetts was a know-nothing state. The governor was know-nothing party. New York was the home of know-nothing philosophy, guys like Samuel Morse, yes, the one who invented the telegraph. He was the author of anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic tractates. So what you find is people coalescing about protecting themselves, all right? The groups become protecting, and what they do is they organize within that protective shell and then vote together. The churches and other locales, as much we do today, not with churches, but in community centers and other places where people learn civic behavior, They come together and then they vote together because they share a common ethos. All right? So 1928, coming back to 1928, Al Smith runs for president, gets beaten badly. Critical election occurs. Roosevelt wins in 1932. And the New Deal coalition holds for a long period of time. The country being in trouble, you know, when the country's in trouble, people do extraordinary things. Instead of having an insurrection, because the unemployment was rather high, the political conditions were rather onerous, we didn't have people running in the streets. What we did was we created a monarchy. We called that monarchy the Roosevelt monarchy, and we elected it 4 times. Essentially what we did was we said, whatever he does is fine, you do what you want. The kinds of restrictions we would place on the president today, or the intelligence community, or the legislative activities, or the president's ability to do whatever he wanted to do, were completely removed. Because the country was in extraordinary trouble. And organically, what the system did was seek to protect itself, gave us the monarch that we never wanted, that even George Washington would not have taken, that monarchy. So we have and it works for a while, and everything's fine. We have a common ethos. We have a common sense of service. People get drafted, or serve, or volunteer, or don't wait to be drafted into the armed services. We rebuild the nation. We repair our infrastructure. The government prints money. Right? The rest of the world seems to be in real serious trouble, but America stabilizes itself. World War II happens. The common ethos arises. We have a sense of polity, of comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y. Okay, the regional differences that were part of American voting patterns, the unresolved issues confronting the South that were not resolved, in my view, until Bill Clinton became the president in 1992, Reconstruction and I mean, if you, just as an aside, anybody who disagrees with that position, and of course you're welcome to in a scholarly way, would have to explain to me why shipping rates were different for southern states and higher than they were for the north. Why effectively an internal tariff system was set up to restrict the South's ability to grow economically. That really didn't end until probably, like I said, Clinton finally came to an end. But coming back to the story. So King Roosevelt is there, the country has a constant ethos, the World War II occurs, people serve, and the voting patterns remain pretty much static. Why? The South is going to vote Democrat because the Republicans did Reconstruction, and they're never going to forget that. The Catholics are going to vote with the Southern Protestants, and they're going to be Democrats, right? And then there's some problems in other parts, the WASPs, whatever they are. We don't have many in New York, by the way. I haven't seen any. I walked down Fifth Avenue looking, are there any white Anglo-Saxon Protestants here? You know, only people answer with the Jews. Yes, we're right. They're not. They're doing whatever they're doing, trying to maintain the power structure. But everybody else is in one place. The country rebuilds itself. The war ends. And then something happens. Because of the prosperity created by the Second World War, people leave the cities, we think, although I'm not so sure that that, in the case of New York, is what actually occurred. My research is all about that. The notion of how we vote begins to change. The idea of prosperity becomes very significant because the income differentiations begin to grow. We had a world essentially before World War II and during the Depression when everybody was poor and there were some rich guys, but people were generally at the same economic level. Now the economic gradations begin to change, and thus the voting patterns begin to change. And the thing that occurs that is most interesting in the post-war period, from my perspective, is as the states' rights movement heats up as a response to civil rights, and I believe to regional economic difficulties. That's my pocket. Regional economic difficulties. There's something else that goes on. There is almost a exchange of congresspeople. What do I mean? Northern Republicans suddenly disappear and are replaced by Northern Democrats who then disappear and become Southern Republicans. There's an exchange of voting patterns where people effectively switch by region. And the Catholics in the Midwest, those Northern Catholics that I talked about, remain essentially in place until 1968. The chaos of the civil rights era, the destruction of the sense of calm and community comes to an end. The streets people see the Vietnam War on the screen every day. The country looks like it's about to be torn apart. The 1968 election occurs. Nixon's the one is about race and about, it really is about race. What you see on the screen in the first really great television race is troops standing there with bayonets and discussion of chaos and how the country has to be cleaned up, has to be put in order, and there's only one guy that can do it. White Catholics see this. The cities that they live in, that they built their communities in, where the parishes are on flames, and what do? They move to the suburbs. They take their institutions as best they can with them because they can't take the parishes with them. Parishes are static. They do what they can in recreation in the suburbs, and they become Republicans. That's a response to the chaos in front of them, the lack of community. And Nixon wins the election with the help of the South. So the very political structure that was created that long period ago somehow gets ripped apart, and we survive that, and we go through Watergate and all the rest, and we go forward in time. Television becomes the medium of communication. There's less discourse. And because of the advent of television and the increase in regional variations and the religious connotation of politics itself, there is less discourse. And there is more competition over resources that the government is now doling out in larger numbers. And the discourse becomes almost violent on some occasions. The only way the federal government can make things happen, and you take the educational system and desegregation as an example, is to use money as the stick and the carrot at the same time, which only increases the competition between regions and areas for federal dollars and thus for political power. While all this is going on, the shift of voters from the north to the south, because the industrial belt where Catholics live is cleaning itself out. Jobs are declining, relative pay scales are declining. It's all going on within a 40 or 50 year period. Pretty fascinating, right? But they remain in the Republican column. And they stay there. Let's see, 68 Nixon. Let's see, 72 is Nixon. 76 becomes Ford. He loses to Carter, who's a really very conservative Southerner, and the response to what people see as chaos. It should sound familiar. Yeah. Right? 1980 comes. Iran, we're in a war. We're really in a war with Iran, because that's really started already. We have economic chaos. Remember the fuel lines? Food prices have increased because the cost of fuel has gone up. Sounding familiar at all? Okay. Reagan becomes the defender of the republic, because we are always looking for that defender to try to clean up this mess. Our eyes go to Washington. We say, here's a guy who looks, he's just got that extraordinary something because television told us so. And Southern Protestants are doing what they've always done, since we can record it anyway, going back to 28. Going back to 32, they're voting with Northern Catholics. And they did that with Nixon. They did it across the board. So that balance remains in place. And as they're together all the time, they do things like they elect Richard Nixon. They elect Ronald Reagan. They elect Bill Clinton. Okay? Why? Economics. And again, the competition for federal money and control of jobs and economic stability in those regions. But then comes George Bush, too, because one is short-term, interesting guy, but gets tossed out on economic issues again, and he gets Southern Protestants and Northern Catholics with the help of Ross Perot. We get to Bush 2, post-Clinton, who wins very narrowly because of the complete schism within the nation. Again, Southern Protestants, Northern Catholics versus everybody else. It's almost an iron triangle. All the terrible things that happen, and then 2002 occurs, right? That's true. 2000 occurs. Forgive me. 96, 94, 92, 96, 2000, 2004. Why is Bush reelected? The numbers are terrible. Insecurity, and I don't think that one applies. And then we get to the present moment of Barack Obama. Barack Obama gets elected because he is the antidote to the insecurity that people are feeling about a failing economy, and they're unsure about national defense and the waning of the American ideal. So we come now 2 years down the road, and what we find, if we look at the data, non-anecdotally, we see that 45% of the American public believe on the night before Election Day that the country is moving in the right direction, that unemployment is extraordinarily high, that the president's favorable ratings are under 50%, that the nation is riven about its future. Sounds like 1928 or 32, right? Or 80. or 92, or 2000, right? So what does this all mean? If you look at the totality of the picture, what you find on paper is that nothing's changed, okay? That the cycles of American politics are rather boring. For example, are they more volatile or less predictable than in decades? I don't think so. The candidates may have appeared more volatile because they're in your living room on television. But voter patterns were not much different. You had candidates who were unusual, different. People are not stupid, by the way. They did not vote for the woman from Delaware for Senate, and I'm sure that she's landing to earth at this very moment, although I'm very concerned that when the bottom of the broom hits, the witch's broom hits the atmosphere of the earth, that it may in fact explode and she could do herself damage. They didn't vote for Carl Palladino, who was out there with her, but he was on a spaceship. They didn't vote for that woman, what's her name, in Nevada, which is very important, by the way, because Reed's son was on the ballot for governor. But guess what? He didn't win. And he knew things were so bad, all he could do was call himself Rory. And before that, he'd been a Clark County commissioner. Clark County, Las Vegas, Nevada, probably the most powerful job in the country next to a Los Angeles County supervisor. Total control over land use and everything else imaginable. So it's not what you think it is. Let me just go back. There's no disruption, really, from my view, in the electoral pattern, which during any midterm election is traditionally and historically a referendum on the current administration. What's new? With only 4 exceptions in the entire history of this country, every single president since Lincoln has lost seats in the House in the midterm election. The modern exception is 2002. What's that about? Well, we just had Pearl Harbor of our generation, and people responded in ways that made some sense. They wanted stability. What has changed, though, and I think this is the part that gets dicey and goes back to what I started. How are we doing so far, by the way? Interesting? Okay. Well, it goes back to what I wanted to say, what I kind of touched on at the beginning when I first started talking. What is troubling is that there is something that has changed in all this. And what has changed dramatically is the sense of ideology and party. And this portends something very different for this country and for any democracy where party becomes obsolete and charismatic leadership becomes the norm of the day. The best example we can find of this right now is in Latin America. You had an existing democracy called Venezuela. We had regular elections. You had 2 parties that were functioning, Democratic Alliance and COPE, which is Christian Democrats. They worked very well. Then suddenly over time, you know, it's great stupidity. Suddenly over time, you know, which means someone woke up, some political scientist or some political consultant woke up and said, well, by the way, I just suddenly noticed it, but what's happening over time. Suddenly somebody woke up and said, wait a second. Both ADE, the Democratic Alliance, and COPE are dysfunctional, non-ideological, charismatically driven, candidate driven as opposed to party ideology driven, corrupt. You sound familiar? Those in power seem to be getting more and giving less. It's all about them, not about us. Okay? System is breaking apart. Old guys don't let new guys in. Somebody runs up the middle. You may be familiar with his name. His name is Chavez. Both parties collapse, and what do you have? A fascist state. Oh, you could argue that that could happen here. Why do I say that? It's my concern because we are not getting civic education. If you ask the average person in the hallways here who goes to this fine institution of higher learning to give you the political breakdown of events over the last 60 years that I gave you, they would probably be incapable. We are losing the ability to translate American ideas into civic learning because we don't have places to do that anymore. For those of you who've read Robert Putnam, you'll know about the argument, which I think is difficult to prove, loss of social capital. It sounds good, but there may be a non-connective way to make the argument by looking and seeing what parties used to do, what civic associations used to do, what they're doing now and what they're not doing now. And the fact is, the Democratic Party, as well as the Republican Party, are in such extremis that they have to hire people to do the things that political parties are supposed to do. So effectively, the people complaining about outsourcing are outsourcing democracy to things like the Working Families Party, to active and professional voter turnout operations. So the parties that were supposed to be there to turn voters out, whose sole existence, if you read the scholars, is about election periods, okay, about fomenting voter activity, are not capable of doing that. And maybe, from a non-scientific standpoint, the only thing that gets people to turn out is an internal clock that I'm convinced voters have that gets them to turn out at a particular time of the year. Kind of like, you know, when the geese fly south and they make your lawn dirty, you know what I mean? Like that, okay? That's what's happening, because the parties are not doing it. What do they stand for? They're queuing devices to tell people where to vote. Is labor the place where people go to get their information from? It can't be, because what? In the public sector, in New York and California, pathological. But you could probably say that under 10% of the entire population of the country, working population is today organized for collective bargaining. Less than 10%. So that would be a place where people would learn how to learn civic information, right? But there's not enough of them organized to do it. Would the local Masonic Hall, right? Knights of Pythias, Oddfellows, Elks, places where people would share particular ideas and have loci for organization, right? Gone. In the history of Catholics in New York, the church was the place where organization first occurred. People used that as a ground to begin to move from. While churches function anymore, the Archdiocese in Manhattan is going to be closing. New York Archdiocese is going to be closing 32 schools. So the places where people were able to organize, the sites where they organized from, don't exist. So how are they organizing? From the television. And from the television, they're not getting ideology. They're getting something else. They're getting imagery of candidates. So when you don't have ideology and you don't have party structure, you have party breakdown. Now, when I was a young guy, the political scientists that I grew up around as a graduate student and before that used to say, well, if you're an independent, then you were pathological because you didn't stand or believe in anything. But the great news, by the way, and the danger to democracy as well, is that that great center where the independents live, who are moving more to the right on a constant basis. And by the way, I don't want, political scientists won't tell you the truth, but because they all lie, you know, I'm only kidding. Political scientists who read the literature know a couple things. They know that the registering, in the past at least, and we don't know if this will hold for the future, for people as independents was a midpoint between going from Democrat to Republican. I'm not sure that's happening right now, because now we have permanent independence. What's happening is that that center of independence is growing, that the parties have moved to the right, and I'll talk about the Tea Party in a second, that the Republicans have moved to the right, the Democrats have moved all the way to the left, the polarization is greater, the great center is this new swing vote, and that great center is growing at an exponential rate. We have never seen as many independents registered at any time in our history as we have today, and not just as independents, but as non-subscribers who choose not to take party identification at all. What does the Tea Party have to do with this? Because you all want to hear about the Tea Party, right? Okay, shake your heads. Okay, the Tea Party is a social movement. Social movements always bear watching because they tell you about the potential for change within a society at a given period of time, at a given moment. They tend to do their jobs, social movements do, and then disappear or become reincarnated in some fashion, in another way that doesn't work usually. I.e., the Civil Rights Movement did its job very well. The Civil Rights Act was passed. They tried to go in the poor people's business. They went out of business, right? They tried to end the war. That was over. The Townsend movement said we need pensions. Townsend movement, for those of you who are alive, not many in the 20s and 30s, very important. The result of which we have pensions today and Social Security, right? See any people saying, let's join the Townsend movement. Did their job, gone. Political parties become institutions. Social movements are temporary vehicles. The Tea Party is a social movement, okay? You have to ask yourself this social movement, the Tea Party, what is it about? What differentiates it? And why couldn't more Tea Party people do better? Social movements have a couple of characteristics, okay? They tend to have their own repertoire of behavior, where individuals collectively behave in a particular way at a particular time. They have their own language, right? They talk about things in ways that we don't understand. We think we do, but the conversations are internal between the participants, not us. Okay? They tend to be single-focused. Single-focused on single issues, single arguments. Okay? Populist movements, I'll give you examples where social movements have become institutionalized in a second, and then died after they met their goals. So what does this mean in practical terms? Why couldn't Carl Palladino talk English? Because he was a Tea Party guy, and everything that came out of his mouth was Tea Party language. So he went in public to talk to people. No one knew what he was talking about. Ditto the woman running for Senate in Delaware. There's a whole host of them. Another guy, the guy who put on the Nazi uniform, he said, this is fine, because he thought people were paying attention, able to understand what he was talking about. He was a Tea Party guy. It had nothing to do with Nazis. And everything to do with his inability to communicate, because he was in that movement and could not break himself free. What's the future of that Tea Party, and what does it mean? Well, it successfully pushed the Republicans to the right, the same way the Civil Rights Movement successfully pushed the Democrats to the left. Okay? Will it be lasting? We don't know. Why? Because I'm not Houdini or am I Nostradamus. Okay? I'm a political consultant and a political scientist. We don't know what the lasting impacts are. We do know the Republican Party has been pushed to a place where it will be very hard to come back for a while. And we do know that there's another problem the Republicans face. And I've talked about what the Democrats face. Democrats were in trouble for 40 years before Bill Clinton came along. I was one of the authors with a fellow named Bill Knapp and a guy named Mark Penn and a guy named Dick Morris of the Clinton's language in 1995 and 6. Here's what, let's see, good commercial was, cutting Medicare, $270 billion violates our duty to our parents. Cutting education, $170 billion violates our duty to provide opportunity for all. Cutting the environment hurts all of us. The president's plan. You can just insert whatever you want after that. I wrote that with Bill Knapp. The Republican problem is that the Tea Party seems to be the province of one Sarah Palin. So what's so bad about that? Well, the problem the Republicans face is they have a winner-take-all political system in primaries. Unlike Democrats who have proportional wins in primaries. So Sarah Palin's not going to win New Hampshire, probably. But my hunch, but she's probably going to win Iowa caucuses, where it's more personal. And she's probably going to go on to South Carolina and win. If that occurs, the pressure within that party to stay to the right, to defeat her, will be not insignificant. Obama is going to he's going to keep on the left because Boehner and those guys are going to make sure he stays there. Because they know what we know, which is successful presidencies tend to come out of the center. Only in points where there's real problems can they come out of the left or right. Reagan on one side, crisis, right? Reagan response to a crisis, right-wing politics. Right-wing politics, there you go. Right, left, no, left, right. Reagan, right-wing, Obama, left-wing, right? Response to crises at a particular time where those kinds of attributes are things that voters want. Obama's going to be all the way over here. Reagan's going to be all the way, great. She's going to be all the way over here, or some other person competing against her will be here. So what happens to the great center? That is the problem we face. And that is the danger in the breakdown of political parties, because we don't know who will run up that middle. That is one of the outcomes of this election, this great polarization. The other thing is what I call the great con job, which makes me more of a pundit now and less of a political scientist. The great con job is that people have gone to the voting booth, the great symbolic place of American power and American democracy in 6, 8, and 10, and upturned the system. What has changed? In the process of upturning the system, economic conditions have worsened. The relative distribution of wealth has remained absolutely intolerable. Absolutely intolerable. The purpose of a democracy survives because you have a fair tax system that redistributes wealth in a way that ensures that there is no social revolution. And American exceptionalism makes us believe that we can never have such a thing happen here, because it's impossible after all. Look at this, but we did have it just last week. Except we didn't have it in the streets, we had it in the voting booth. But the third time. So what do you think is going to happen the fourth time? You think people are going to say, oh yes, I don't like these clowns, I'm throwing them all out, and I'm going to go on my way and be happy? If you looked at the faces of the Tea Party people, you'd have to presume that that's not the case. All populist movements at some point revert to some type of overt activity, whether it is in the street, in other ways, going back before Williams, Jennings, Bryan. I would suggest to you that if you think about the anti-immigration movement as a populist ideal, and which resulted in the creation of the Know Nothing Party, proof that a social movement, anti-immigrationism, right, Know-nothingism could become, or the American Party they call themselves, could become an institutional player and then meet its goal, which is gaining power and then going out of business, which is what happens with social movements, right? Well, which happens. So I would suggest that if you look at the face of the Tea Party people and you realize that, that even lunatics have something legitimate to say, something to hang it on, which is there are no jobs, the industries that people in those movements, in the states where they come from, are not coming back, that the era of the $75 an hour auto worker, including benefits, is over, that pensions, where pensions really are is questionable. When people figure that out, they're really going to get nuts. When you have this entire change going on at one time, that you'll see some kind of social reaction. What makes the mix even stronger, or what changes the dynamic and maybe makes it more stable, is the changing nature of the American population itself. We live at a time, and you hear this all the time, of great change, but we really do. The time is very close when the American we see will not be the American we knew. What does that mean? We think of America as a European melting pot. That is over. We are seeing now, for the first time in our recent history anyway, a nation which can tie less of its roots to Europe than it can to South America or Asia or Mexico. A nation which is very different in every way, shape, or form, where the political ethos will be more reflective of populations we don't know an awful lot about, but we're going to have to learn to acculturate with and to assimilate with as well. So I think it's kind of interesting. I don't think anything's changed in the system, but I think the external pressures on the political system are such that future voting patterns may change. One thing is sure, and then I'll take your questions. African Americans are the most reliable components of the Democratic Party, and it has less to do with race than it has to do with the word Democrat, and the studies are pretty clear. That is sure. The other thing is sure is that with the Republican control of state legislatures and an unparalleled means, that the Congress has a higher probability over the next decade of remaining somewhat Republican because of reapportionment. If you look at states like Alabama, where I believe the people in their wisdom chose to have Republican constitutional officers, governor, lieutenant governor, auditor, secretary of state, and attorney general, and keep the legislature in the hands of the Democrats, did the exact reverse for the first time in 100 years and tossed the Democrats out. To do such a pathological thing, pathological because it is not done, tells you that the electorate is angry and disturbed and hoping that the political people will do something to change the conditions that created the anger in the first place. I, too, as an American, hope that they will, and now I'll take your questions.
Yes, I'm Michael Feiner.
Good to meet you, Michael Feiner.
I am. Well, I also went to the school back in '67. I had the portables and the huts and all that. It was pretty cool. Jewish centers. My question is about, you never addressed the nastiness in politics. I think it all evolved from back in 62, 63, 1 meter, with the First Family album, and I went into David Fry, who started Obscure, Lyndon Johnson, all the way to the current era. And I haven't seen anything quite like how things got when Clinton was president, and then it got worse with Bush. I think what happened with Bush was the Democrats have become jealous, and what they say and do about the Republicans is incredible on the internet. And what I've noticed, the levelness of nastiness in politics has never been higher. The flyers that the politics distribute, some of them go as far as really Republican.
Forgive me, I think
swastikas, burning Twin Towers that are attributed to the opposing candidate.
Thank you, Ronnie Reverend, for the water. Yeah, good.
Right. There's one with Senator Paladin, and he's sitting on the beach and he's doing all the work. And my question is, to what extent is the nastiness going to begin? How much further can you say there's no insurgencies going on in the streets? Who's to say that it evolved from the streets to the internet, where people are going back and forth with each other? And quite frankly, we just had a meet the candidates night at my civic association.
Yep.
And we were ready to kill these candidates, but we didn't want to.
Yeah, but your question, what you're really saying is, Hank, what is going on? Why is it so nasty? And what does the future portend? Okay, I thank you, Mr. Feiner. It's a good question. I think I can answer it in a different way. I hope you will like the answer. If not, you'll have to invite me to a candidates night so I can act like an idiot, okay? First of all, this is not new. I would suggest that the first negative campaign occurred by that great protector of democracy. He was the guy that did it. His name was Thomas Jefferson. And he tried to get Alexander Hamilton killed, which he ultimately was successful at, and published newspapers and documents excoriating him and even talking about his racial background. Alexander Hamilton, the creator of the American currency system, and the rest was black. Simple. Okay, so he was a great man, Jefferson, right? The Democrat who did that? Disgusting. They went after Andrew Jackson's wife. They called her a whore on the front page of the newspaper, they being the owners of whatever media was available at the time, because he had the temerity to invite average people, Andrew Jackson did, into the White House. How dare you do such a thing? Let's see what else. Abe Lincoln, a great man by any measure, was portrayed as an ape and as an animal and a monster on front pages of newspapers across the country. Corporations did that because they owned the newspapers. Let's be clear. Let's see what else we had. I'm sorry? Cleveland was another one, the illegitimate child, which in fact he did have, by the way. The scholars tend to indicate. But was that the business of the public at the time? Jack Kennedy was, like Al Smith, was excoriated because he was a Catholic. And it took a tremendous amount of courage for him to stand up, and also the help of organized crime in West Virginia and Illinois to stop people from complaining about his Catholicism, which they're pretty good at. This is not new. What is new is the amount of television and the amount of money in politics that is permitting these kinds of messages to be used. That is different. The amount of money being spent in politics is overwhelming. There was a piece done on me. I get a call from the late Sid Zion, who was a reporter at the Daily News and the Times, an interesting fella, died recently, in 2005, I guess. He said, there's a young reporter I want you to talk to, and he wants to do a piece, and he needs to do it with you so you can get in the papers. I said, great. So I didn't know what the hell I did, but I always like to help people. I'm sitting there, and I do this interview, and the Sunday Times shows up at the house, and there's a magazine, and I open up, and the back panel is, all the borough president's men, Hank Sheinkopf is told to, and I forgot the guy's name, but I hope his career has been a good one. I said I felt like Carl Furillo, the Reading Rifle, for those of you who remember the Brooklyn Dodgers. Because he made about $2.30 a year and had to live in a walk-up, and, that was that. And he was a major league star. And when I broke into the business, that's the kind of money we made. We didn't think we were that smart, and we did. A lot of this did this because I was solidly the first generation. Second generation consultants. The first time I got paid to do politics was in 1969. And I met the woman of my dreams, who I divorced, which is always wise. It was a bad dream. Anyway, the point of the story is that it's gotten more nasty because there's more of it. And that is the difference. And then unregulated internet, which everybody seems to think is wonderful. I had a fight with this with a fellow who believes and kept telling me about the freedom of the internet. And I said, well, it's okay, but if we have FCC regulations that require that you identify your ads on broadcast, then you ought to identify them on the internet. And we're not holding people responsible to a level of discourse that befits a democracy. It is true, and one of the better books written about politics, still used in classrooms 50 years afterwards, called, The Semi-Sovereign People, by E. Schatzschneider, who talks about, in the prologue, talks about that in order to have a democracy, you need to have noise, and that what commonly becomes the sub-governments really, people underneath that you never see, destroy democracy, and you need to have the noise, but you need to have noise that people take responsibility for. What makes this more complicated and makes it worse and defines where the money comes from, which really goes to answer your question at another level, is that these governments at the representational level do not work for the people. The United States Congress does not represent you. That is the problem that the Tea Party people are really screaming about. The people who are elected to the state Senate, the state Assembly, the United States House of Representatives, less so the US Senate, because there's more public view. Well, how do we define that? Because they get killed more often, i.e. they get knocked out of office. But the people at these local legislative levels really don't work for you. They work for the mining industry, the oil and gas industry, the physicians, the insurance companies, blah, 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 the trial lawyers, because they pay for campaigns because the cost of doing campaigns is so high. A very important book, which I don't recommend to you, written by Anthony Downs many years ago, called An Economic Theory of Democracy, makes the case that ultimately what is logical is that people want to get the benefit that they want to get, which means that they want to get reelected. So therefore, people will do what they have to do that. So all the letters you get at home from congressmen on complaints and congresswomen that come off machines that print these things are machines that print these things, but your interests are not attended to because the interests of voting for things that will determine how much campaign money comes in the door in most cases is much more important because the rational act is to get reelected. If you're interested in this stuff, there's a book by David Mayhew called Congress, The Electoral Connection, which I recommend to you. And there's stuff done in interest groups by a political scientist named Jack Walker that I also recommend to you. But that is what's occurred. We have become, in the creation of democracy, there's a whole theory by political scientists in the 60s and 70s, less so in the 70s, but certainly in the 60s, that groups were the way that people organized, and I touched on that before. Well, in fact, that's the case. But the groups that are organized in Congress are the interest groups. That's why we don't get minutes of subcommittees. Because if you got minutes of subcommittees, you'd really know what was going on. Then you'd really get sick, and then everybody would be a member of the Tea Party. Okay? Carlisle. Carlisle Towery talks.
I've watched you on television several times and wonder if it is new. You said none of this is not all that new. How our information coming through television seems to sort of unabashedly mix news with opinion. And we don't allow newspapers to do that unless they do. But at least we have a page that says and then the rest of it's supposed to be rational reporting. Yeah. But on television, it is increasingly difficult to know which is news and which is really rhetorical and which is opinion. Do you agree with that, or am I just?
I think that Carlisle Towery says that it has become more difficult to determine. We should all thank Carlisle Towery for his service to the people of the city, who's helped create real jobs for an awful lot of people and real institutions. But Carlisle Towery's question is kind of personal to him and to a lot of the rest of us. Is what we are seeing in the coverage of campaigns news, the coverage of public life news, or is it something else? What is the differentiation between news and opinion, and is a viewpoint being portrayed rather than rather than anything else? Are we able to get hard news anymore? And I would suggest the answer is no. We never got hard news. Whether it was, and the New York Times coverage of the Middle East is a perfect example of absolute unquestioned bias. The Wall Street Journal's coverage of Democrats, in most cases, is an absolute bias. Depends on the circumstance. And also, there's a guy who found me in the South Bronx in the early part of my career who told me that I would be a great man in politics. And I said, you're absolutely insane. He took his teeth out and put them on the table. He was insane. He took his teeth out of his mouth, put it in a napkin, and it changed out. And one of the things he taught me, he's dead now, his name was Walter Diamond. One of the things he taught me was that everything's fine, but it really all depends whose ox is being gored. So the conservatives have a beef that they needed to create their own broadcast opportunity called Fox News, and their own journals and their own think tanks that are all part of this to get a particular point of view across. The answer is yes. Was there unfair coverage of things? If you watch New York One and you listen to this one anchor, when the word Republican comes up, she starts talking, tapping, dancing, and singing. I don't know what occurs. It's like, she lost her mind. Is there a bias? There's always a bias. The question is, does it interfere with people getting information? I would argue that Americans are getting more information than ever before, and they're able to discount what is not true. They're getting more information, not less. Well, you're right. This young fellow here just got out of high school says they're getting maybe too much information. That may in fact be true. The 24-hour news cycle has changed what news is. Content changes by the minute because the situation in public life changes by the minute. A case in point in my own career. I got a phone call one morning. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning, and the call was, let's see, the governor's gay. He's coming out of the closet you will know what this is in a minute. Coming to the closet at a news conference at 4 p.m. They're trying to extort $50 million out of him, and we need you in Princeton in an hour. It's the kind of call you get every morning, you know? It's just, you just say, I know that call's coming today. I can't wait. I change the lead of the story for the press corps every half an hour because to catch up with the news cycle. And then it became live news. So the timing of the cycle, which never ends, the need to create content, which is endless, creates news that isn't news, and opinion that's not rational, because what we live in is, and this we can thank Walter Winchell and the gossip columnists for, is a culture of gossip and entertainment. And there is absolutely no reason why, and rationally, that gossip and entertainment should not be the way that our political systems function, and by the way, they are. Because we're less concerned in coverage, and there's studies done about this. I think if I may be mistaken, but Dr. Jameson at the Annenberg School has done a lot of work in this area. Coverage of news in campaigns versus coverage of tactics. By that I mean the horse race. Now, we're all rational people in this room, right? What would you rather read, the horse race or the coverage? Would you rather read a position paper that's 75 pages long that talks about grants and aid formulas? Or would you rather read about this one's ahead this way, on this day, by these points, because he did this and that, and X and Y, and so said? Of course you'd rather read that. Would you rather watch a negative campaign ad, which has the right music? Dr. Jameson has written about this, Kathleen Hall Jameson. Has the right music, is kind of entertaining and interesting? Or do you want to sit and say, oh yeah, that's him and the dog and the wife, or her, the husband, and the dog? Which would you find more interesting? It's kind of like the notion of pornography. I had a guy once say to me, he said, you know, Sheinkopf, those ads you create are pornographic, they're so harsh and mean. I used to create some pretty harsh and mean ads. I said, how so? I'd say to him, well, he said, they're just pornography. I said, did you ever watch pornography? He said, no. I said, well, would you sit there like this when you saw it then, so you know what it looked like? Look, it all depends whose ox is being gored. But the content is changing because the strictures and the variables I just talked about. Increased need for content, more information going out, which may in fact not be true, unverifiable internet access, failure of people to take responsibility for information on the internet, okay? And a real redefinition of what is truth, which is a serious problem, and but I think you're right, and not the purpose of this particular lecture, but a serious problem we face in a world where gossip and entertainment have become the staple rather than hard information, with a population that is less civically educated and subject to more rumor. Dangerous. Yes, ma'am.
Why has it been so difficult for a viable third party to gain power in the United States? You have so many dissatisfied voters. You have voters that know that 50% of what they're told is garbage and lies, and yet you have never, other than Ross Perot, came closest to having a viable third party.
Well, we did. We had the Whigs, and we had, in New York State, we had the anti-Masonic Party, which was very successful.
I'm not talking about 200 years.
The Know-Nothings were very successful in New York State. Question is, serious question, very important, one that I'm going to try to answer quickly. Why have we not been able to have a viable, this lady is using that, this fine woman is using that word, a viable third party in this country? For a host of reasons. One, voting is a habit. It's habitual. People tend to do the same thing again and again and again and again, okay?
Is it lack of leadership?
No, I don't think it's leadership. I think it's the fact that voting is a repetitive process. It's learned. Remember I talked before about the internal time clock, which I have no way to quantify, but I have a theory that that's really the case. And someday I'm going to do some field work on it, and you're all going to be bored by the outcomes of the study. Voting is a habit. People tend to vote in one way or another, okay? Matter of fact, in your block, depending where you live in New York, you live in New York City, right? On your block, you know, how many people, if you said to people, I'm voting Republican today, they would, you know, they might come in with an axe and come to kill you, depending where you live. Or they might send you to a psychiatrist. You said you're voting Democrat and you live in Glendale, they might say, okay, we'll have the guys out to get you later. It depends where you live and what the pressures are on you. But generally, people tend to make single choices. They tend not to manipulate the ballot. They tend to vote in columns and lines because people cannot store information in the same way. If there's an issue there's a concept called issue dissonance, where we know social scientists have been pretty quick pretty able to prove over time that multiple ideas can't find People just can't contain them. There's too much going on. There's too many other stimuli, number one. Number two, with the two-party system in place, the state boards of elections and state election laws generally across the country are rigged to ensure that qualifying as a third party is very difficult.
So it's a defect in the structure.
Well, it's a defect in the structure, but frankly, it's good for the stability of the system overall, I would argue, because I will now give you examples of countries that have multiple party systems. Italy does not work. Doesn't work. Okay, it doesn't work. Germany sometimes works. Okay, Merkel is working out. Kohl stayed too long. England, they're a 12th rate power, which exists simply because we make sure that they have atomic bombs and enough weapons and money. I mean, I can go on and on. Israel, it's insane. They have a multi-party system. In order to correct it, they corrected it by ensuring that they could directly elect the prime minister. It just doesn't work. It does not provide the stability, and those governments tend to collapse. But you're right about defects in the system that ensure that the system protects itself, which is both good news and bad news. And we do it, but, well, I'm going to get there in a second. The abilities to raise money, and what I'm worried about as someone who cares deeply about democracy, okay, and who spent his life trying to make sure that people vote, not that they don't vote, but that they vote. I'm very concerned about a rich person with nothing but charismatic leadership and cash running up the middle to create that new party, which is those blanks or independents or non-subscribers in the middle that I talked about before. So we'd better hope that whoever does that is a good human being. Ma'am, someone? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'd like to know what's your opinion on what Obama's done so far, and also if you think that the anti-Obama feeling has anything to do with his race.
It's a very important question. Has two parts. One, my personal opinion. Yeah. So if I'm getting this wrong, I want you to tell me, please. I'm being asked for my personal opinion about what Obama's done so far. I'm going to take care of that in a different way. Two, do I think the negative reaction to him has anything to do with race? The answer to the second one is yes. The answer to the first one is I'm not a happy guy because I'm a Democrat. I'm unabashed. I'm a Harry Truman Democrat, which means I believe, and there aren't that many of us left, in a strong national defense, in providing opportunity for people, in stopping corporations from raping and pillaging the land. I believe in a fair tax system. And I believe that America is the beacon of light for the world, not something to be ashamed of, that American values have been the great organizing tool for the world system and have kept Russians from doing what they like to do, which is killing everybody in Europe, and have stopped people all over the world from killing each other until late when we failed to do our job. That being said, my beef with the Obama administration is about the health care plan, not for the reasons you think. I believe in single payer. I think a civilized system has that. I don't think that giving 1/6 the economy to the insurance industry is a good thing. I faced off against the insurance industry as a consultant in trial lawyer versus insurance industry battles throughout the South in the 90s. I faced Rove a lot. He lost a lot. I did not in those battles. I think that it is as an observant person, as a religious person, I am very deeply concerned, and I think about that in the American context, the context of the American system, about a healthcare system controlled by an industry whose sole job is to actuarially ensure its income. That is very dangerous because when you concomitantly when you put that to the following fact, this is not internet nonsense or some creation, that 48% of every healthcare dollar is spent in the last 30 days of life. That if you are actuarially concerned about this, there won't be the last 30 days of life. There won't be the last 60 days of life. There won't be the last 90 days of life. There may be the last 120 days of life. That's not the American way, and that's not what religious people do. I would rather have seen him stand up and say, I'm for single payer, that's my principal position. Which brings us to the basic problem, not with him, but with the political system at large. If we are a culture of gossip and entertainment, and we are, anybody who denies that, anecdotally, go to any newsstand and tell me what you see. The dehumanization of women and gossip and entertainment in those windows. Right? If that is the case, then our politics are not separate and apart. Which brings us to another point. We often fail to understand that what happens in our politics is reflective of the society at large. If we're not engaged in discourse, then we're going to do something else. If we can't create coalitions, then we will polarize. If there is no national common weal, then there will be individuals acting out. The politics determine what our society is like. These things have real impacts. This is not a game. This is serious. But what we have turned it into is Saturday night, Monday Night Football, rather than understanding the value of it. A vote by Congress to defund or not fund significantly transportation systems in the East, and instead to make sure that oil companies do better by funding 4-lane highways, results in pollution, a loss of jobs, a loss of revenue, and the destruction potentially of lives and of urban centers. These are serious things. These are not accidents. So when a president of the United States says, let's make the insurance industry well because that's the best I can do, I get nervous because I don't like corporatism. And as a political scientist, and I presume there are others in the room, we know that in nation-state development where corporatism stands. And it is very close to fascism on the scale of nation-state development, and that is not something good because you destroy choice, you destroy freedom, and you create bureaucracy. Dangerous. That's my position on that particular one. I hope you understand. Thank you.
One more question, Leanne.
I just want to quickly ask you, as an English professor, one of the things that I try to do is show students pathways between where they are and where they might get to. And I think sometimes there's a disconnect in the liberal arts. They don't quite understand how to get from point A to point B, and one of the tasks we have here is to explain that. Could you take a moment to explain how you got from CUNY and to where you are now, academically, professionally? I hate to.
I'm not a great, Alan Dobrin knows me longer than anyone in the room, and I'm not a great self-promoter in that way. I've always let my ideas and my accomplishments. I was a poor kid from Hunts Point in the South Bronx. My mother was 15 when I was born. My father was 19. I was out of the house working when I was 12. I was separated from my brothers. I went to a place called Green Chimneys, which is pretty well known. I'm on the board today, which is a residential center for tough kids. I lived on the street a lot, dropped out of high school, decided to go back. I had to find a place to live. I lived with the Rosses at Green Chimneys, and there was only one place for me to go to school, without which I would have never got an education. My father was a resident of New York City, even though I hadn't lived there for a year. I came back. I lived in the basement of a house on 78th Road and 153rd Street because I thought I was going to Queens College. But somehow, somebody signed a piece of paper when I went to register at Queens. They told me I wasn't there, but I was going to this new place called York, which had buildings, which was operating out of a public school on Springfield Boulevard, which didn't make much sense to me. Anyway, the toilet was upstairs, and the shower was upstairs. You didn't do it that often because you didn't want to disturb the landlord. And I worked in restaurants, because I figured you'd never starve while I was putting myself through school. And then in 1969, I was trying to pick up some extra money. Parking, we used to have parking lots on Jamaica, on Hillside Avenue, 179th Street. They're probably not there anymore. And I knew a fellow whose father owned a lot, and to pick up some extra dough, and then in the process, I joined the Restaurant Workers Union. I was a county man, and I'd get 30 a day. I think that was a lot of money. I worked at a place like the Stage and the Carnegie at night. It's pretty tough work, 6 days a week. Anyway, so the guy's father owned a lot said to me, I was making $20 a morning, I think, with tips, I'd got $5. He said, how'd you like to pick up $30 a week? I said, well, what do I have to do? Because, reasonable, I always like to drink, and it was 35 cents a shot and 15 cents a beer, so I did the arithmetic pretty quick. And he said, well, this is campaign. It's 1969. Campaign, and I said, what do I have to do? A little of this, a little of that. Well, okay, well, I did that, whatever this and that was. And the guy was Herman Badillo, and he was running for mayor. And it changed my life, because here was a guy who had come to New York City as an orphan, without a dime in his pocket and no family, a lot like me. And free education. CUNY had saved his life. Thank you.
Mr. Sheinkopf, and that is what we do at CUNY and certainly at Queensborough Community College, is educate, offer opportunity for advancement. I think many of you in this room are illustrations of that, and certainly probably no more than our guest lecturer. And we're very appreciative of your remarks today. Thank you. As is our tradition, we have a small reception outside, and you can mingle a bit with Mr. Sheinkopf. It's part of our program for today. We appreciate your coming here and look forward to seeing you at the spring lecture. Again, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Sheinkopf.